Right, so they'll tell you this is diplomacy, a grown-up government making necessary adjustments to deal with new realities in Syria. They'll say we have to be pragmatic now that Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham controls the state. But you only need to look at what the British government actually did to understand what's going on here. They took a group born from the Al-Nusra Front, linked to al-Qaeda until they split in 2014, now governing through executions and mass killings, all documented by the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, and they removed its terrorist designation despite that. And at the exact same time, of course, Palestine Action remained proscribed, a non-violent direct action movement in Britain for targeting weapons manufacturers. Just compare that to HTS, who since seizing power from Assad last December have apparently killed some 11,000 people amongst ethnic minority groups. If you want to understand British counter-terror policy today, the rule is very simple. Killing civilians is now diplomacy. Stopping arms exports to Israel is what terrorism is. Right, so the break came when the British government removed Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham from the UK's list of proscribed terrorist organisations in the last week. That was the moment the old assumption about terrorism stopped working, the assumption that terrorism law is tied to violence, the assumption that proscription is grounded in protecting civilians. I mean, political violence being in the very definition of what terrorism is, but that's gone by the by, apparently. The assumption that the state will not recognise power built through killings, disappearances and coercion is where we are now. Well, that assumption collapsed the instant the Home Office laid the order before Parliament and framed it as a necessary step to enable engagement with Syria's new governing authorities. The language was all administrative, as parliamentarians tend to be. The implications, however, very much were not. A state does not delist an armed group while killings are still being documented, unless the purpose of proscription itself has changed. And this is a point where people who have not followed the evolution of British counter-terror law under the Starmer regime tend to misunderstand what they're looking at. Proscription has never been simply about stopping violence. It's always been a tool for shaping which actors the state permits to operate politically, financially and diplomatically. Who can be met with, who can be funded, who's allowed to talk, who's allowed to speak, who can travel, who's allowed to claim legitimacy in any given situation at any given time. The terrorism label has always been an instrument of statecraft, and statecraft has always been about power, not principle. The delisting of HTS, therefore, this bunch of al-Qaeda cast-offs, it's not an aberration, it's the logical continuation of a state that treats legality as a function of strategic interest to whichever government is in power at the time. Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham did not transform itself into a civilian political organisation before this delisting. The leadership has not changed. The enforcement structures did not disband. The group's origins in Jabhat al-Nusra, the Al-Nusra Front, linked to al-Qaeda, functionally the Syrian wing of that group, until the public split announced in 2014, are part of the documented record. The split from ISIS reflected factional conflict within militant networks, not a rejection of armed ideological rule. When HTS assumed control of the Syrian state following the fall of the Assad government almost a year ago now, it did so through power already held by force. There's no evidence of demilitarization. There's no evidence of renunciation of coercive governments. The British government did not require evidence of either before removing the terror designation. And this matters because the state has now demonstrated that it will recognise power regardless of how that power was obtained. If a group can seize control of territory, institutions, state functions, well, the British government will apparently treat that as sufficient grounds for engagement now. Violence does not disqualify. Violence is merely another means of governance so long as the outcomes align with strategic interest. The humanitarian framing of counter-terrorism collapses on contact with this decision, therefore. The delisting makes no sense if the protection of civilians is supposed to be the principle. It makes complete sense if the preservation of influence is the principle. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which despite the name is a British-based monitor with long-standing documentation networks in Syria, reported that nearly 11,000 people have been killed in Syria since HTS took power. The figures include more than 8,000 civilians, amongst them hundreds of children and hundreds of women. The same reporting recorded more than 3,000 deaths as field executions. These deaths did not occur in the past. They occurred during the period in which HTS consolidated state authority. The killings were not incidental to war. They were a method of rule. Now, it's important here to be precise. The British government did not dispute these figures. It did not attempt to reframe them. It did not suggest that the observatory's reporting was in any way unreliable. did not attempt to provide a counter-narrative. Silence was the admission. The silence mattered because it signalled that the facts themselves were no longer relevant to the determination of legitimacy. What mattered was control. It's all that mattered. Control is a currency of international recognition these days. Whoever controls the territory, whoever controls the institutions, becomes a negotiating partner. The British government did not claim that the killings had stopped. It did not claim that HTS had undergone any form of internal reform. It removed the terrorist designation regardless of all of that. This is the moment where the logic has to be stated plainly. The British state did not remove the designation because violence ended. It removed the designation whilst violence continued. Therefore, proscription is no longer being applied based on whether a group kills civilians. It is being applied based on whether that group is now useful to the British state. To understand the scale of this shift, it's worth looking at how HTS constructed the appearance of state legitimacy after they took power. Earlier this month, the new authorities there staged a parliamentary process presented as a step towards democratic normalisation. But the structure of that vote made its function very clear. A majority of seats were allocated through appointed electoral colleges. So the given leadership of HTS decided the format there then, put these colleges together, and they then produce a desired result, it could be argued. A further share was to be directly selected by the president himself, the head of HTS, as he was then, as he is now, Ahmed al-Sham, formerly known as Abu Muhammad al-Jilani, complete with $10 million US bounty on his head. Well, not anymore, there isn't. He's deproscribed. He's legitimate now. Several regions did not participate at all in the vote, though. So this was not a transfer of power to the public, it was the organisation of rule. A parliament that cannot remove the authority that appointed it is not an instrument of representation, it's an instrument of control. And this is where we need to maybe slow down a little bit, because this is the point where the propaganda becomes disguised as politics. Western governments, they love the appearance of elections, don't they? Elections allow them to tell the public they're dealing with a democracy, or at least a democracy in progress. But a parliament that exists only to affirm the will of an armed executive is not democratic, it's a rubber stamp. The visual theatre of ballot papers and formal seating arrangements, everybody sat nicely and all dressed nice and pretty, is a performance designed to communicate legitimacy to those watching, to communicate it externally, all whilst maintaining coercive rule internally. And Britain recognised the performance and played along. So when the British state delisted HTS, it was not recognising a democratic transition at all. It was recognising a governing apparatus that had demonstrated control of the state machinery. Stability here does not refer to peace or safety. Stability refers to predictability for states seeking to maintain influence. Stability means Britain can now speak to one authority, not many. It means intelligence agencies know who to call. It means diplomats know where to go. It means that even if people are still being killed, the killing is structured. And this political restructuring was followed by diplomatic elevation. Ahmed al-Sham appearing at the United Nations General Assembly as Syria's head of state. No Syrian leader had addressed the UNGA in decades. That appearance signalled to all the other states that the new authorities were being treated as the legitimate political leadership of Syria. And once that signal had been given, delisting in the UK just became the legal adjustment required to operate within that diplomatic reality. The sequence is pretty clear, therefore. The state power has been secured, parliamentary structure has been formalised, international platform has been granted, Western legal recognition followed in due course. But there's a price to pay. Meanwhile, reporting documented the resurgence of ISIS operations in eastern Syria. ISIS no longer functions as a territorial state per se, if it ever really did. It's just reorganised into dispersed operational cells engaging in ambushes and roadside attacks and targeted killings. Surveillance networks reported that fighters rearmed after accessing weapons depot during the collapse of the prior state structure. Data relayed by the Syrian Democratic Forces counted over 100 such attacks between January and August of this year. This resurgence did not occur in spite of the new order, it occurred under it. The security environment remains violent and unstable, and yet the British government chose this moment, right now, to delist the armed authority. To expand on this point, we need to look directly at how the British state interprets strategic interest. British foreign policy in the region is not organised around humanitarian protection, it's organised around influence and access and alignment. So when a government falls and a new authority takes control of a state in which Britain has strategic interests in, Britain must decide whether to recognise that authority. Recognition preserves influence, non-recognition cedes influence to others. So the delisting of HTS was the mechanism through which recognition became operationally possible. The British state judged that it needed to maintain engagement with whoever now governs Syria. It therefore adjusted the law to permit that engagement. The law was changed to suit themselves. This decision was made to maintain strategic positioning, not because HTS ceased to govern through coercion. The British state did not present evidence showing any demilitarisation or civilian protection. They'd find it very difficult to find some, frankly, given that 11,000 people have been killed from ethnic minorities since Ahmed al-Shara took control as head of state in Syria. Instead, it presented the delisting as necessary for diplomacy. The word necessary in this context does a lot of heavy lifting, because it does not refer to the protection of life in any way, shape or form. It simply refers to the preservation of state influence. This is where the domestic hypocrisy, though, has become unavoidable, because at the same time all of this is happening, that the British government removed the terror designation from HTS. It is, of course, facing a judicial review, having designated Palestine Action as a terrorist organisation. Palestine Action, the UK-based direct action movement that targets the operations of British arms manufacturers supplying Israel. The movement has, as we know, conducted property damage and industrial disruption. It likes to throw red paint over planes and that sort of thing. No deaths have resulted from its actions. Its purpose is to prevent material support to military operations. The state could have prosecuted these actions under existing criminal law. It chose not to. It chose to use counterterror law, and that's why they're in a legal bind over it now. But yet this is where the implications become unmistakable, given what's happened with HTS. The state has criminalised non-violent resistance while legitimising an armed authority. The state now shields those who kill and have killed 11,000 people since seizing power, and punishes those who try to stop the killing by targeting arms manufacturers. How twisted is that? Terrorism as defined by the state, by this Starmer regime, no longer refers to the use of violence. In point of fact, it can't possibly do so. It refers to interference with state-aligned power instead. So the message to we, the British public, is unambiguous. If you obstruct the capacity of the British state, the Starmer regime, to maintain its foreign alliances or its weapons export networks, you will be designated a security threat. This is the collapse of the difference between national security and obedience. It means protest is only acceptable when ineffective. It means solidarity is tolerated only when symbolic. It means dissent is permitted only when it poses no actual friction against state power. When direct action becomes a threat to strategic interests, the state moves to criminalise it under the most powerful legal framework it can grab hold of. Proscription law allows seizure of assets, extended surveillance, and the criminalisation of association. When applied to non-violent movements, it signals that the state no longer distinguishes between political resistance and threat. That surely makes the state itself a threat, therefore. The killings recorded under HTS rule show what the state is willing to accept simply for being strategically useful. Nearly 11,000 deaths since the takeover cannot be dismissed as collateral. They're evidence of the conditions under which authority is being exercised. Britain's delisting shows it's prepared to accept those conditions, that it's a price in blood that they accept. The proscription of Palestine Action shows it's prepared to suppress non-violent resistance to those same conditions. Amoral just isn't a big enough word. It's utterly, utterly obscene. This is not mismanagement. It's not oversight. It's not contradiction. It's policy. This is policy they've deliberately chosen. And the state believes you will accept this because it believes you have been trained to hear the word terrorism and to stop thinking the moment you hear that word. It believes you will not examine what the law is being used to protect. It believes you will accept violence as long as it is framed as stability. It believes you will accept repression as long as it is framed as security. But the record is clear. Delisting of an armed authority responsible for mass killing, staged parliamentary legitimacy, international platforming without accountability, resurgence of ISIS activity under this new order, proscription of a domestic non-violent movement resisting arms supply, terrorism law redefined to serve state power. They think exhaustion will become consent, though. Are you too exhausted to care about this, though? It's another example of two-tier care at the end of the day, though, isn't it? One rule for protesters, another rule for religious extremists and al-Qaeda cast-offs. But it's happening here too. A British Palestinian doctor suspended from her job over her support for Palestine, yet literal British citizens fighting in the IDF. Tumbleweed from the powers that be on that one. To get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already. so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated, holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.